With the release of the book Two Esoteric Tarot, it is my pleasure to once again talk with the author, poet, and essayist Peter Mark Adams. This new book, published by the Scarlet Imprint, it's a conversation between him and Christophe Poncet about two decks, the well-known Tarot de Marseille and the more obscure Sola-Busca deck. Many of you will know Peter Mark Adams for his ethnographic and visual research into ancient cults. I had the opportunity to speak with him a few years ago for the launch of his insightful Mystay, in which he uncovers the initiation into the cult of Dionysius as depicted in the frescoes of the Villa dei Misteri in Pompeii. In his latest book, Peter discusses an enigmatic Renaissance work of art to which he previously devoted the excellent The Game of Saturn, also published by Scarlet Imprint in 2017. Anyone familiar with Peter Mark Adams' work may expect a meticulous, profound, and engaging exploration of the Sola-Busca deck, which it is. But beyond that, he broadened the scope, opening up the field for a deep dive not only into North Italian Renaissance context of the deck, but also into the very origins of Western esoterica. Hello, Peter, and welcome back to the New Mithraic.
Hello, Andrew. Lovely to see you again. Looking forward to our discussion.
All right, so it's a pleasure, as I was saying, and then in this occasion, we will be talking about this particular book. Let me show it because it's really, I mean, I have been reading it. I was fascinating not only by the deck, but all the information that is here. I had the impression sometimes that the Sola-Busca deck is an excuse actually to go very, very deep into Western esoterica, to talk about different subjects. So it's not just for people who are interested in the tarot, but it goes beyond that. I mean, if you are interested in paganism, if you are interested in Mediterranean esoterica, philosophy, and history as well, because we talk a lot about the Renaissance period in North Italy. It's an excellent book, so I strongly recommend it. And I am very, very happy to talk with you about this. So we will dive directly into this. And the first thing I want to know is what drew you to study the Sola-Busca Tarot?
Well, I've been interested in tarot since, I don't know, I was 15 years old. Studied tarot, I read tarot professionally on occasion. But when I encountered the Sola-Busca, it was almost like by accident after the purchase of the cards by the Brera Gallery from the last private owners, 2009, and then the exhibition and catalogue kind of made them more publicly accessible. And when I looked at the imagery of these cards, I couldn't believe that I couldn't understand anything about them whatsoever. They were completely oblique, and yet they had a huge artistry. They obviously invested a lot of time, energy, and money into the creation of these cards, and yet there was only one copy of them in the world. So all of these kind of enigmas, these paradoxes, drew me in on what became a kind of detective adventure to try and understand what the heck was going on with these cards and what they meant and what that signified.
Actually, as I was saying, your book is fascinating because you are really diving into the meaning and the significance of these cards. And as you were saying, they are very difficult when you look at them. I mean, we are used to the other tarot, right? Like the tarot where it's like very obvious. You have the justice is, well, you can tell that it's justice, or they are talking about different. Sometimes it's less obvious, but in general they are, right? And in this case, it's not the case. You have just one figure, you have just one name sometimes, but sometimes that name doesn't seem to fit, or even it's very, very difficult to know. We wonder why they are talking about this person that is not at all known, or it's not like an important person. We have Alexander as well, Alexander the Great. So that one, okay, that's something that we know. But in other occasions, we are talking about about figures that are like a secondary. They are not like a... So my second question will be that how did you approach the task of decoding such a complex imagery and symbolism?
First thing is I had to spend an awful lot of time just absorbing the information on the face of the cards. I can't I can't underline too strongly how much time that required.
Yes, yeah.
Rather than being, so to speak, put off by their opacity. I was convinced there had to be an underlying significance. I just couldn't see what it was. And eventually I understood two things. One is that there were historical references or apparent historical references related to the names given to many of the trumps. And that ultimately you could trace those names to one chapter of Plutarch's Parallel Lives,
Exactly.
for instance, parallel life of Cato, for instance. But that didn't really help at all because it didn't help unlock the iconography. So I began to look at the cards from a symbolic perspective. And one of the first things I focused in on is the presence of two figures, one with a upward pointing torch and another figure with a downward pointing torch. And it was, yeah, these are the two.
These ones, right?
So the other thing that struck me about these two figures is their corresponding coloration, which is like red, green, purple, but they both have the same colors, but the colors are transposed. So the purple legs become the purple armor, the green hat becomes the green armor, and the red, and so on. The other thing that struck me is that the card on the right is number 2, but when you read that as a Latin numeration, it gives you 11. And the upward pointing torch is 11 in the sequence. So there was a color connection. There was the torches. These are the only two cards really which seem to be corresponding to each other with torches, with this coloration, and with this numerical relation. So the thing that immediately struck me is, well, it was a hypothesis, really. Let's assume that these are the torchbearers from Mithraic imagery. Okay, that was the working assumption. That would make them Cortes and Cortopates, respectively, who represented the portals through which mortals entered into incarnation and exited from it. So those so-called gates of the sun from Plato. So, okay, so with that hypothesis, I said, okay, if the torchbearers of Mithraic iconography are present, I wonder if the bull is present. That was the next step. So I started looking through the cards, and one of them is called Deo, that's to say God, and Toro. Actually, it refers to a historical figure, Diotorus, but that's one name and it's spelled differently. And he does occur in Plutarch's Parallel Lives. But here they've split the names up into two to underline the fact that it has this ambiguous reference. So it gives you a reference to the bull. So I thought, okay, there's a game going on. There's a game being played here with us. If you have the bull, can you find a figure who could be the figure who oppresses the bull, which is, say, Mithras? Well, there was no obvious Mithras name, but there was a card which appeared to depict the constellation Perseus. And that is Cato. I think the card number 4 or something.
Okay, Catone is the 13. Is this one?
Okay, that one, yes. And what struck me with this card is that it looked like Perseus from the perspective of the fact that Perseus cut off the Gorgon's head. And there's this monstrous head on the floor. There's also the armor and various bits and pieces of weaponry that were given to Perseus in order to do this. And the fact that the left eye of the ghoulish figure is pierced. Okay. So in the myth of Perseus, of course, he cuts off the Gorgon's head, whose left eye in star terms is the fixed star Kaput Algol, which is the most malefic star of all. Okay, and again, this now, okay, so Mithras and Perseus are equated, according to David Ulansey, in southern Anatolia. They were kind of interchangeable figures. So we actually had the core elements of the tauroctony being used here. But quite to what end was not clear at this point. It was clear as well that there was a celestial element being introduced. Why else to emphasize such a malefic star as Kaput Algol? There were other celestial references to the moon, but in its waning phase, not in its waxing or full phase, the waning moon, which again is kind of characteristic of a chthonic energy.
It's that you're talking about this card, right?
This is a very important card because this is the one that started to open up the possibility that I was dealing with a ritual grammar or ritual process embedded within the deck. And specifically, this card would seem to indicate the performance of a ritual, because there are elements in that card which don't make sense. First, the waning moon. Secondly, the strange vessel that the figure is holding. Okay. And that vessel looks like a spinning top. In other words, it doesn't have a proper rest. It could only be vertical if it was held or it was spinning. And that led me to consider what context a spinning vessel has in a ritual. And of course, it led me to think of the toys of Dionysus. So the toys he's playing with when he's killed by the Titans were magical implements in their own right in subsequent Hellenistic tradition. Okay, so there we have the waning moon, this strange open-ended cup, and the fact the figure is gripping its beard, his own beard, which is long-standing iconographic reference to an act of masturbation in European iconography. So we have this mixture, therefore, of seminal fluid and the chthonic influence. This is a second one in which he's holding the beard. This is a second one. The one you just showed, he's also holding the beard, I think. Yeah. Can you show the previous one?
I can show, but I think in the other one you have the beard that is inside this sort of cup.
Okay, okay. So it's, yeah, it goes into the ritual implement. So again, there's a task of decoding this, and to do it, you need to know the relevant ritual processes within the Hellenistic tradition. This one is depicting a thing called drawing down the moon, which is attested from, like, I don't know, 500, 600 BCE unto today. It's still a ritual enacted today. And it's basically what is happening is the people are waiting for an alignment of the celestial bodies that generate a certain type of energy, drawing it down through the moon into some kind of receiver, which would normally be an item or a liquid. And that's what seems to be happening here. It's drawing down the moon as a core ritual still practiced today. Okay.
Well, I
So
want to talk about that because that's a main focus on your book. But before we move there,
yeah,
we'll comment a little more about these two rituals that you identified. I want to talk a little bit about the Mithraism symbology that you have
mm,
here,
mm,
and then because some authors will probably argue that the cult of Mithras fell into oblivion way
yeah,
before the Renaissance, right? Because we know that the church has a lot of power during the Middle
mm,
Ages and then also the
yeah, yeah,
Renaissance.
yeah.
So, how will you respond to that? How can we find embed in this deck something that has been forgotten already, or maybe not?
Yeah. It seems to me that the core imagery of Mithraism is derived from traditional Hellenistic sources. Okay, so we have, for instance, the famous Phanes plaque showing Phanes with his wings emerging from the cosmic egg with the body wrapped by a serpent. Now, this image directly implements an Orphic text describing the creation of the universe. Okay, the serpent Kronos generates an egg which cracks open. The two halves become the sky and the earth, and within it is a winged figure of Phanes. And clearly in Mithraism, Phanes, Apollo, Helios, Mithras were considered to be equivalent to each other. Okay, so there's a strong connection between the Orphic cosmogony and Mithraism. And I do, in fact, see Mithraism as a Anatolian cult, a Hellenistic cult that spread once it was adopted by the Roman elite. And with their postings around the empire, individuals would finance and set up their own Mithraea. It was not, in other words, a state cult of Rome. The Roman state cults were circumscribed, had their own priesthood. Mithra wasn't one of them, but it was evident in almost every corner of the empire. And it's that distribution that needs to be accounted for. If it's not a state cult, how is it so pervasive on every, especially where the military were congregated, on particularly on the frontiers? So on the Rhine and the Danube, on Hadrian's Wall, and in Syria, we see a preponderance of Mithraic cult centers. So military connection and clearly postings of senior military figures who had the finance to set up their own Mithraea. The amazing thing is that it managed to sustain a coherent iconography despite this massive distribution. Okay, so
How do we
clearly
find that in the Renaissance? Because that we are talking about the first between the first and the third centuries.
okay, so the connection to the Renaissance is the fact that there were two Renaissances, not one.
Mm-hmm.
The first one was a Latin Renaissance in the late 14th, early 15th century. And that was associated with the recovery of the Latin literary canon, okay? The Latin literary inheritance, in fact. The second Renaissance occurred around the beginning of the 15th century and is associated with the return of Italian scholars from having studied in Constantinople, learned Greek, returned to Italy, and brought a massive amount of Hellenistic texts and philosophy with them. So, for instance, Giovanni Orispa returned from Constantinople, I think twice in the early decades of the 15th century, and he brought with him hundreds of manuscripts, which included complete works of Plato, complete works of Proclus, complete works of Plotinus, and most of Iamblichus. And that is like the spiritual and liturgical core of Hellenism. that was available in Italy from around 1425, 1426. And it's the dispersion of that knowledge which generated the Second Renaissance, which culminated, I think, in Marsilio Ficino's translation of these texts into Latin by the mid-15th century. Okay, so it's inevitable that Hellenistic iconographic ideas would have entered Italy with this. And secondly, the recovery of Mithraic artifacts in Italy became very popular in the early decades of the 15th century. There had been a long-standing tradition going back to the 14th century of elite families trying to find bits of stone with names on it that they could claim to be their own. Okay, so they could put them up in their own villas and claim to have a Roman descent. So this kind of picking through the remains of Roman buildings and cellars and so on had led to the discovery of a lot of Mithraic iconography by the 14th century.
In your book, you talk about Ottaviano, the relief of, I think it's Ottaviano, right? Ottaviano.
Yeah.
Relief, right, of that is one of the that was discovered also in the 16th century, I think, that we use. And another thing that you mentioned, and I think it's quite astonishing, is this card. In this card, we see a figure, a male figure between in the 10 of Cups, right? And then, you identify him as Plethon, as Georgios, Gemistos, Plethon, and it's figuring this card that is quite prominent. It's like the 10 of Cups, which is a very positive card in a regular tarot reading. If you can talk a little bit about this figure, because I think it's also main one in the deck.
Yeah, we can identify him because he appears in a painting in Florence of a procession of Byzantines who came to Ferrara and Florence in order to attempt to reunite the Eastern and Western churches. Okay, it was an attempt to unify with the West to hold the Ottoman army off, and it didn't work, of course. But anyway, the painting of the Ottoman delegation includes a figure almost identical to this.
Yes, I see that.
And this figure is incredibly important in Western esoteric history because he was a practicing Hellenist, that's to say a pagan. He developed a complete liturgy to allow the worship of the ancient gods, and he taught this. Okay, it wasn't just academic for him. It was the actual practice of pagan religion. So that when he came to Italy, he was an advisor to the Byzantine emperor and the emperor's son. He's a very senior figure in the Byzantine court. So he was in Italy and taught in Ferrara and Florence and introduced Platonism and hence Hellenism to the Italian elite. So they now had the literary inheritance of Hellenism, and they now had the leading scholar of Hellenism, who was a practicing pagan in Italy for a period of 4 or 5 years. Okay, so this really, I mean, the essence of this belief system is important. It taught your soul is eternal. It transits through many lives, and it has its own spiritual trajectory that you can influence. And this stands in complete contradiction to what the church was teaching in Italy, which is to say, your soul is created at the moment of conception. At death, it is consigned to heaven or hell for eternity. And the only way to guarantee heaven is to do what the church tells you. So these two philosophies are fundamentally opposed. And one of them represents, so to speak, subservience to the church. The other represents spiritual freedom. And it was that message of spiritual freedom that so generated the commitment and interest in Hellenism that you see with Ficino, the practice of theurgy even though he was a Christian cleric or priest, the two went parallel with each other. Okay? He had to obey the church, but he was looking for an accommodation with a more profound metaphysics with church teaching. And that conflict was never resolved, actually. And it lies today at the heart of the pagan and Hellenistic esoteric movements of Europe. It's still the issue dividing the two.
And also that aligns with what we know about Mithraism. Well, I mean, we know from Porphyry. Some people will say that Porphyry is not exactly, I mean, that he was a Neoplatonist, that he didn't know the cult of Mithras from firsthand. But it is true that when we look at the cave of the nymphs, that is exactly the idea, right? That your soul will go
the entire metaphysics is explained on the Cave of the Nymphs. It was a standard text that everybody knew. Porphyry was one of those key authors. And the iconography of Mithraism, as I've said, is derived from Orpheism. It's not like it just sprang out of nowhere in Italy. It didn't. It had possibly millennia of concurrence in Anatolia. And not only does the name Mithra occur in a treaty between the Hittites and Mitanni from 1400 BCE, but the Mitanni king's royal seal includes a figure kneeling on the back of a bull and pulling its head back.
Many people, many scholars or many researchers will say that the cult of Mithras has nothing to do with the Eastern traditions that with the same god, right? That it was something that was redone. And I mean, there is a point there because it's quite different. But one of the arguments is that one in particular, that we don't have the god Mithras killing the bull in the way that we find it in Roman Mithraism or Roman cult of Mithras. But there is actually a few evidences old. We're talking about the Hittites.
Also, it gets confusing because the Persian invasion of Anatolia in the 6th century and the occupation, which lasted until Alexander the Great defeat of the Persian army, those 2 centuries brought a lot of Persian influence into Anatolia. So you have a dynasty, the Mithraites, for instance, Mithraites of Pontus, like 6, 7 kings with that name. They were descended from a Persian root. You have the adoption of Persian style of architecture in Anatolia at this time. You see it with the Hecatomnids down in Caria, who were a native dynasty who were able to act as satraps for the Persians. So, and then ultimately you have Nemrut-Dar, where you see the shaking hand imagery for the first time in a kind of cult context. So this is why people can easily get confused. The crossover from Bronze Age Anatolia to Persian to Hellenism is a vast continuum that needs to be taken account of. Okay. It's a much bigger playing field than many of us imagine. And the other thing I'd just like to add here is that many of the elements of the Roman imperial army were not Latins. Okay, by the 1st, 2nd century, most of this army would have been locally recruited. Okay, so that included a large body of Anatolians because the borders of the empire were in Syria by this point. It included, the Eastern Empire was a significant economic player in the total Roman imperial picture. More so, I would say, than most of Europe, certainly far more than England, which kind of remote barren outpost in comparison with the riches of the Eastern Empire. So the orientation, the balance of power and financial wealth was towards Anatolia and Syria. So there's a substantial cultural substratum which needs to be taken account of when we think of Mithraism, even though the preponderance of Mithraea were on Danube and Rhine borders, so to speak. Okay.
Well, coming back to the tarot, the imagery of the cards, you have like a different theories as well, right? There is a lot of scholars that talk about this connection with alchemy that you also mentioned, but you don't say that is fundamental, like it's like the main thing. There is other things because you have also mythical figures, grotesque figures, and you have also some homoerotic connotations, which is quite unusual for that period of time when you have the Inquisition, right, in all Europe, and particularly in Italy, in the north of Italy, and you have like cards like this one where that show depict like I mean, it's quite obvious, right, like the almost sexual connotations that you can find here.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah.
So we wonder how was the recipient of such an unusual piece of art?
Yeah. Okay, there's a complex political story about the creation of the cards at a particular date, with a specific coats of arms decorating the deck, and the initials MS.
So
So
this is
the Sanudo family of Venice, one of the major patrician families who ran the Venetian state for centuries. And MS is I believe was Marin Sanudo, because these cards were made in Ferrara at a time when Ferrara was trying to recover from a war with Venice that had pretty well destroyed its economy. So I began looking for a connection between Sanudo and the war. And it turns out that after the war, Ferrara sued Venice for reparations for the damages and the financial loss incurred. And it was like a court case that went on for ages. One of the figures on the Venetian side appointed to oversee the negotiations was Marin Sanudo. The man who designed these cards in Ferrara, I believe, was his correspondent. So they would have met in person in the course of the negotiations in Venice. Now, Marin Sanudo was the younger of the family. He had very little money. Most of his life, it was kind of chasing an income. But he was kind of acknowledged as having a vast intellectual capacity, a very capable individual otherwise. So there was a point in time when the reparations were paid, and in the same year, these cards were produced and dated to that year with his coat of arms, with his initials, and given to him in Venice. Okay, so now...
And also we have the year that this deck
1493, yeah.
indicated in one of the cards, not in my deck because I don't have that reparation, but there is the date, the year.
And that was the year in which the payments were first made by Venice to Ferrara. So it looks like the cards were a kind of gift to him. He was notoriously gay, by the way, so the homoerotic references in the cards make sense. What can I say? He became fabulously wealthy after this settlement. And the Venetian state never trusted him with a major or any role, actually, thereafter. Although he was a member of a very, prominent family, he never got another appointment from the Venetian state. So the suggestion there is that he actually betrayed them in settling the reparations, the payment to Ferrara, that he benefited from it directly. And he became kind of the black sheep of Venice, despite the fact that he had fabulous wealth thereafter.
All right. So we tend to think about the Renaissance at least when I think about the Renaissance, like something very positive, there's an artistic revival,
Yeah.
refinement and wealth. So you find the refinement, I guess, you find the wealth as well, but it is quite obscure. This deck is quite obscure. So how will you explain that? Why is something like made in the Renaissance with this background that we have in mind so obscure?
Yeah.
How do you interpret?
It very much seems to fit Sanudo's taste. He was a notorious collector. After he got the well, he built up one of the finest libraries in Europe. It was one of 3 libraries in Europe. People would visit Venice just to have access to the Sanudo library. It had maps, statues, scrolls, vast collection of books. I mean, 5,000 books in 15th century was a major library. And the Sanudo, his personal library was far in excess of that. Thousands and thousands of books. I say, people would come to Venice just to have the opportunity to visit if they got an invitation from him. It was his personal dwelling as well. And he was part of the literary establishment because he had manuscripts that the Aldous family were able to publish for the first time. So a major figure in literary history of the period. So this deck of cards had every ingredient that a man with Sanudo's intelligence and proclivities would be able to appreciate.
Looks like
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about the philosophy of this deck, because there is a lot of like
Yeah.
epic there, and then there is a subject that we in the New Mithraic are very into. And then we have this, for instance, this card, but this is an expression, that Latin expression that repeats along the deck, which is TRAHOR FATIS.
Yeah.
And then we can translate TRAHOR FATIS, that I am drawn by fate, right?
Yeah. I would say driven by fate.
Driven.
Yeah. One
And
of the characteristics of Gemistos Plethon's philosophy was that the earth was governed by the Saturnian force. Okay, so that when Zeus overcame Kronos, Gemistos would have thought in terms of Kronos rather than Saturn. So we're not talking about the planetary deity. We're talking about Kronos, the deity who was overthrown by Zeus and then cast into the underworld. And Gemistos talks quite openly about this. He says, yes, so that means that Kronos and the Titans are the commanders, so to speak, of planetary Earth. So they are the correct deities to address if you want to affect change through ritual. So the Saturn feature becomes central to Gemistos's metaphysics. And because it's central to his metaphysics, it embodies itself in the liturgical or ritual grammar of the Sola-Busca. It's all to do with invoking the spirit of Saturn or Kronos to the ruler in order to strengthen them in ruling.
it is a very deterministic and fatalistic view of the world. When we already this expression, and that is something that doesn't really match with Neoplatonism or Gnosticism.
Yeah. So Gemistos Plethon was a fatalist, totally. He said everything is determined. And it was one of the points at which many people could not go along with his metaphysics. As you say, it's not compatible with the Renaissance spirit. It's kind of a more archaic or archaizing vision of life as fixed, determined. But yeah, one thing I need to say, though, is that he didn't see the underworld deities, the Titans and Kronos, Saturn, as demonic. he says the gods are intrinsically good. Okay, so they just happen to be a force which operates in certain deterministic way. They're not evil. They're not like the Gnostic demiurge. This is not Gnosticism. It's Hellenism. And there's not an intrinsically evil force, okay, which is a very Christian concept.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Hellenism doesn't have that. So since writing the Game of Saturn, it's one of the major transformations I have in my thinking about Plethon and about the philosophy behind the cards, is that they don't represent this kind of evil overseers of humanity. That's not his vision. For him, the gods are intrinsically good, but yes, it's highly deterministic or fatalistic in its outlook.
You point out to the cosmogony embedded in the deck, and then we talk about Mithras. You have, of course, it's like you see it everywhere. I mean, you can find all the seven traditional planets, and you're much more than that, because depending on what you are looking at. But here in the deck, you only find a few astral entities that has been chosen. Can you tell us why? Do you think it's that way?
They're all martial or chthonic. They're chthonic because, as I say, you know, the guiding spirit behind this deck's metaphysics is Saturn Kronos as a fallen deity. And it's highly martial because Plethon taught that the rulers needed to be martial in order to survive. So for the Byzantines, that meant fighting the Ottomans. For the Ferraris, that meant fighting the Venetians. They were only a small city-state, so they were easily overcome if they didn't develop their martial abilities. So the deck is a kind of survival manual for a small city-state surrounded by very powerful neighbors, like Venice, like Milan, like Rome, the Vatican, or like the French or the monarchy from Naples. These states were in a constant state of conflict with each other throughout the Renaissance. It was a very violent time. And the Ferraris made their income from campaigning, basically. They ran the mercenary armies that went out each season on hire to other states and fought for them. So it's a very martial atmosphere. It's not like Florence, where you have a banking elite, very wealthy banking and financial center. The Ferraris had no resources apart from taxation on the River Po and the ability to muster an army of paid fighters and go out on hire to other rulers. So yeah, the deck has a very martial feel to it.
Mm-hmm. From all that we have said, we can deduce that the Sola-Busca wasn't a wedding present like other tarots at this time, for sure, because it's like appropriate, let's say. And from its pristine condition, because it was found as almost haven't been using that much, so haven't been used for playing probably. And then because of the obscure and deviant imagery, it doesn't seem to have been used an educational tool either. So what was it for?
Well, I think it was an elite gift. It was a repayment for something, or for a huge service that had been done to the Ferrari state, but in a form in which it was very personalized to the character of the individual who was going to receive it. Okay. I'm sure that it was accompanied by a large financial settlement as well. That's my personal feeling. And the subsequent history of Marin Sanudo suggests, yes, he all of a sudden came into fabulous wealth. I can only assume that was a percentage of the reparations paid by Venice to Ferrara for the war damages. And he had negotiated a percentage for himself for Ferrara to pay back to him. So this card is also incriminating of that. The card you showed me of the kneeling figure with the Sanudo coat of arms was notorious for having betrayed his own family. Yeah, Boko. He's a notorious figure in Roman history. He betrayed his own nephew to the Romans in order to be made a king. So the card actually depicts a notorious act of betrayal.
And actually, that was the reason for that was what was made. But how do you think if that was for Marin Sanudo or for another person, how do you think they used it, or what did they use it for?
I'm skeptical whether anyone could use these cards without a very very special training in the ritual apparatus that's embedded within them. I suspect that the depiction of that ritual apparatus occurred before the painting of the cards for Sanudo. In other words, the cards may have existed before the personalization for Sanudo. What I'm trying to say is that there's information encoded within the engraving that has nothing to do with the use of the cards as a gift. Okay, I think they embedded something in this particular format for a reason and then adopted it as a payment gesture to Sanudo, so that it has a depth in it which you can't recover without access to materials that we have today. For instance, the ritual grammar of Minoan or Mycenaean art has only recently become accessible. I don't believe it was accessible during the Renaissance. So to understand the ritual gestures, how would you go about that in the Renaissance? You need a modern apparatus of scholarship to decode the cards and find their originary meanings. So I think it includes something very, very special that wasn't necessarily all intended for Sanudo, but it provided a convenient gift for somebody who would be satisfied with the surface meanings. There's a lot about this card deck and its circumstances which still needs to be researched and understood. That's quite clear to me.
Actually, you identify two different reference to two rituals.
Yeah.
One that you mentioned that before, that one called drawing down the moon, and another that is related to the cult of Saturn Ammon.
Yeah,
if I am right. And then what are these rituals for?
the ritual is to invoke the Saturnian power for the ruler. So if we go back to the court cards, for instance, are based on the Alexander Romance literature, but they only reference that part of the Alexander Romance literature which has to do with his conception, not with his conquests. Okay,
This is
so
the card with Alexander, just to
yeah, he was conceived, the story goes, by the god Amun via the last prince of Egypt, Nectanebo. So that Alexander himself claimed to be the son of Amun and went to the temple of Luxor, where the birth chamber in the inner sanctuary is the place where the pharaoh would renew their sonship of being the son of Amun. And subsequently, he went to the Siwa oasis, which is the oracle of Amun in the Libyan desert, and had his status as the son of Amun confirmed there. So this apparatus is reflected in the court cards and in the fact that Amun is the kind of spiritual force or form of of Saturn, form of Kronos, that is being invoked in the final ritual. And that's so, if, in other words, if that force was good enough for Alexander the Great and for what he achieved, it must be good enough for a Renaissance prince.
I guess so.
Yeah, so it has its own kind of logic. If you're going to be possessed by a god and you have a kingdom to rule, the same god as Alexander the Great would be fine. There's a logic like that at work.
All right, so we are arriving to the end. I have a couple of questions that I wanted to well, I have a lot of questions, but I have two in particular. As I was saying, there is a lot of information in this.
It's a labyrinth.
We are just to select a few items because there is a lot of information, a lot of knowledge.
Yeah.
And then we have left aside main subjects, but I wanted also to talk a little bit about the honors, because you mentioned already that this deck has been in the same family for 5 centuries, which is quite remarkable.
As far as we know, yeah.
Did you have the opportunity, after reading this book that was published in 2017, you have the opportunity to discuss your findings with a member of the family?
No. The name is not publicly known. I think that the deck was sold under conditions of confidentiality. I assume it's descendants of the Sola-Busca family line. The cards were certainly in their possession in the 18th century. Where they were before then, nobody knows.
But the family, sorry, I'm not sure if I understand that well. The family is related to Sanudo, to Vermeer Sanudo.
No, not at all. No. Sanudo died in 16th century. And then there's a gap of 200 years or so where nobody knows where the cards were. All his goods, I think, were auctioned in Venice, and we don't know who bought the cards, but somebody must have and held on to them. And finally, they came to the Sola-Busca family.
Okay.
And it's then that they were first mentioned in an antiquarian text. In 18th century antiquarian wrote about them. So we know they were in their hands at that time. And then again, subsequently, we don't know where the cards were. But all of a sudden, the Brera Gallery purchases them for 900,000 euros, substantial sum of money. We don't know who they purchased them off. We're guessing it was surviving relatives of the Sola-Busca line. We don't know that for sure, even. So there's so many gaps in our knowledge with this strange artifact.
Well, we have arrived to the end because we don't wanna take much more time. I really thank you for that. Just to end, as I say, the Game of Saturn, this fantastic book that I have here with me.
Yeah. And a lot of updated information into esoteric tarots. I've had a lot of time to think about it. So Christophe Ponce and myself have a conversation there about the two decks and how they relate to each other, which can be.
I don't have the book here, but it's another very recommendable book that has been launched very there it
is.
That one is
another beautiful book.
Then complements the Game of Saturn.
Very much.
An update of the information that you will find there. As I was saying, it is a necessary and fascinating travel from antiquity of Western esoterica to the present day, because we talk also a little bit about what is going on today with this deck. And I strongly recommend to anyone interested in European history, ancient philosophy, mythology, and Mediterranean paganism. That say, those of us fascinated with these topics would greatly appreciate your insights into the Mithras cult. Have you considered of authoring a monograph on this subject? And if so, have you taken any step in that direction?
Yeah, about half of it is written. I hope to finish it or complete it this year. So let's see how that goes.
But that's great. That's great
I,
news.
I have that, and I have. I think I'll be in Luxor. You know, I've just done a course, 3-part course on the Egyptian mysteries, which is online from Magical Egypt. So I may be in Luxor in May of this year to give a lecture on the Egyptian mysteries on site, so to speak.
Oh, that will be fascinating. And then
Yeah.
it's something that is like a course, something is open, or
Yeah, it's open. It's just, you know, anyone who wants to sign up. We'll advertise it in the coming
right.
week. It's a very recent discussion, so we finalize it this week possibly, and then we'll advertise it.
Well, we're looking for that. Thank you so much, Peter, for being here with us for a second time. Then I
You're
hope,
welcome.
and then
My pleasure. My pleasure.
our pleasure. Thank you.